Hello, everybody, and thank you for joining me for another tier list. Today, we're going to be taking a look at the discography of Simon and Garfunkel, a duo that left some very important contributions to 60s and early 70s music, as well as being key figures in the folk rock movement. They had tremendous success, and they left us music that is truly timeless, and they've written songs that will be forever regarded as classic hits. And they're also another example of a group that had a lot of friction and tension together, and unfortunately they were never able to completely bury the hatchet, but they still managed to give us some really amazing music in the midst of all of that tension. So another very important group that I'm happy to be covering for today's episode, and what I'm going to do is go through their 5 studio albums, starting with Wednesday Morning 3 a.m. and going up to Bridge Over Troubled Water, and I will score each of them on this tier list, with S being the highest and D being the lowest, and I'll talk a little bit about each album, let you know my thoughts, and we will see where we end up. And please feel free to let me know your thoughts in the comments, where you agree and disagree, and how you would rank these 5 albums. I would love to hear your thoughts. Alright, I think that's about it. Let's jump right into it. Okay, starting out, we have their debut studio album from 1964 titled Wednesday Morning 3 a.m., and I will give this a B. Not a bad album by any stretch, but in comparison to some of their other records, I would say that this one doesn't stand out as much, but it still certainly has some awesome songs that I would regard as Simon and Garfunkel classics. Stylistically, this one is very folky with stripped down instrumentation, only incorporating vocals, acoustic guitar, upright bass, and banjo on one track. We have 12 songs on here, with only 5 originals written by Paul Simon, and the remaining 7 being covers or arrangements of traditional songs. And because of the fact that this album contains more covers than originals, I don't feel like the entirety of this album contains that classic Simon and Garfunkel sound. I think we definitely do hear it on the originals, but I think some of the covers veer away from that sound that they were developing, and can sometimes make this album feel a little bit scattered in certain spots. But still, in the midst of that, there are some really amazing songs. The album opens up with 2 covers, with You Can Tell the World and Last Night I Had the Strangest Dream. And I don't think starting the album out with 2 covers right off the bat was necessarily the best choice, because we're not getting that Simon and Garfunkel sound yet. I don't mind the opening track, I like it on its own, but in the context of a Simon and Garfunkel album, I don't find that tracks 1 or 2 are the types of songs that really bring the listener in and make them want to see where the album is going to go. But once we get to our first original song with track 3 titled Bleecker Street, this is the moment where we get that first taste of that beautiful Simon and Garfunkel sound, with the very pretty and lush vocal melodies and harmonies, the tasteful finger-picked guitar part, and just the general peaceful and serene mood of the song. And as far as favorite songs from this album goes, this would be my second favorite song on here, and it would also make my top 10 favorite Simon and Garfunkel song list. So certainly an incredible first original to introduce on this album. And then that is followed up by another awesome original titled Sparrow, a moody song that really showcases Paul Simon's impressive finger picking, which was pretty ahead of its time for 1964, and I've always felt that Paul Simon's guitar playing was pretty underrated. And to me, when you listen to the 2 originals in comparison to the 2 covers that opened the album, to me the quality in the originals is just so much stronger, and I think if they were able to do more originals and less covers, it definitely would have increased the quality and cohesion of this album. After that, we have an arrangement of a traditional song titled Benedictus, and I really like this one. I think the vocal layers are very pretty, and the bowed upright bass adds a really nice additional texture to this very pretty arrangement. And then side 1 concludes with Simon and Garfunkel's most popular song, The Sound of Silence. This one being the acoustic version. They would also release an electric version of it on their next album, and honestly, I prefer this version more. Both versions are great, of course, but if I had to pick one, I do think I tend to resonate more with the stripped down acoustic version of the track, so that's another positive thing I would say in favor of this album. So that concludes side 1, and as you can see, I do think the majority of it is very good. It's got 3 really solid originals. The arrangement of Benedictus is very pretty. I'm just not the biggest fan of the way it opens with the the two covers. I don't mind the opening track, like I said, but track 2 is kind of a skip over for me. And in my opinion, when you look at all of the songs on side 1, I think the originals are really the ones that stand out, but certainly not a bad opening side to this album. And then we have 6 more tracks on side 2 with 2 more originals, as well as 2 covers and 2 traditional arrangements. I do think that side 2 is slightly weaker than side 1, but not by a huge margin. I do enjoy the 2 originals, He Was My Brother and the title track, Wednesday Morning 3 a.m., but if I had to pick my 2 favorite originals on here, like I said, I would go with Bleecker Street and then The Sound of Silence. So I would say that I think the originals on side 1 are a bit stronger, but regardless of that, I still do enjoy all 5 originals on here, and I would have preferred more of them. For the arrangements and covers on side 2, I really enjoy their interpretation of Peggy O. Really beautiful vocal harmonies, and The Sun Is Burning would be my favorite cover from this album, so that is the one big thing I would say in favor of side 2, is that it contains my favorite cover of this record. But the one thing that kind of makes side 2 lose a little bit of steam for me is a couple of the song choices, with the arrangement of Go Tell It on the Mountain and the cover of Bob Dylan's The Times They Are A-Changin'. Not that there's anything wrong with either of these songs on their own, I just think for me personally, I don't really have a desire to hear Simon and Garfunkel interpret these songs. I don't think it blends particularly well with their style. I think The Sun Is Burning is a cover choice that works much better with their style and timbre as a group. But even in the midst of those couple of issues that I have with this album, I still think it is a good record. All 5 originals are great. I think most of the traditional arrangements are good as well. I just think a couple of the cover choices do take away from it a bit. But luckily, this will be their last album to feature more covers than originals. So from this point on, we will hopefully get an increase in quality in the future albums. But regardless of that, still not a bad first release by any stretch, just not as good as some of the stuff that would follow it, in my opinion. So I will give this one a B. Okay, moving on, we have their second studio album from 1966 titled Sounds of Silence, and I will also give this a B. Not a bad album, but still not one of their strongest releases, in my opinion. And I know most people regard Wednesday Morning 3 a.m. to be their worst album, but believe it or not, I actually like that one slightly more than this one. I think Wednesday Morning 3 a.m. has a couple of more standout tracks, and stylistically, I like the stripped down folky nature of that album more than the direction that they decided to take for this one. So a little backstory, after the release of their first album, the sales weren't doing very well, and the group had actually broken up temporarily, but they decided to reunite after a producer named Tom Wilson took The Sound of Silence and he overdubbed some parts and made an electric version of it without their knowledge, and it ended up blowing up and resulted in the duo getting back together to record this album. And I do think that this album has a lot of elements of it that are enjoyable, but also because it was recorded in such a rushed fashion, I don't think that they took enough time to really flesh out every track to produce the strongest and most cohesive album that they could have. There's a lot more going on from an instrumental standpoint with keyboards, drums, and some electric guitars. We have 11 tracks on here with 9 originals and 2 covers, and I do think the majority of side 1 is enjoyable, opening up with the electric version of The Sound of Silence, which is the reason why this album ended up getting made. Like I said, I do like the acoustic version better, but of course I still enjoy this version too. Leaves That Are Green is a good song. Kathy's song is very pretty, and I love the guitar work on track 6 titled Angie, which is an instrumental version of track 5, which I thought was kind of a bizarre choice, and I resonate way more with the instrumental version of it, and it's another one that is, again, a great showcase of Paul Simon's impressive guitar work. So for side 1, I could do without Blessed and Somewhere They Can't Find Me. I don't think that either of these songs are particularly exciting and do take away from side 1 a little bit for me. Then for side 2, we have 5 tracks, and I enjoy 3 of the 5 songs on here, and they would actually probably be my 3 favorite tracks from this album as well, with A Most Peculiar Man, April Comes She Will, and I Am a Rock. I Am a Rock would hands down be my favorite song on this album. Probably not a big surprise to anyone. This one is a Simon and Garfunkel classic. But I don't think that Richard Cory and We've Got a Groovy Thing Going really add anything to this album, and stylistically feel sort of out of place to me, and that would be my main contention with this album. The scattered tracks that I'm not crazy about I don't think are always stylistically cohesive, but still in the midst of that, they do deliver us a handful of really beautiful and solid songs, like Kathy's song, A Most Peculiar Man, April Come She Will, and I Am a Rock. Obviously, The Sound of Silence is also great, but since it was an already released song, it always feels kind of weird to me to include that song as something in favor of this album. But if it wasn't for that song getting re-recorded, we may never have gotten another album from Simon and Garfunkel, which is pretty crazy to think about. So a pretty good album, but not one of their best. I will give this one a B. Okay, next we have their third studio album from 1966 titled Parsley, Sage, Rosemary, and Thyme, and I will give this one an A. A very good album, and definitely an improvement from the first two releases. I think the quality in songwriting greatly increased. The album feels very coherent, and the general mood of this album is very dreamy and peaceful. This one has 12 songs with 10 originals and 2 covers. I think side 1 is very strong. It has 6 tracks, and I absolutely love 4 of the 6 tracks on here, opening with a beautiful arrangement of Scarborough Fair, taking a classic song and putting that Simon and Garfunkel flavor on it in such a tasteful way. I will say that I've never been crazy about track 2, titled Patterns. For whatever reason, that was one of the songs on this album that just never grew on me, no matter how many times I listened to it. I do, however, absolutely love track 3, titled Cloudy. This would also make my list of top 10 favorite Simon and Garfunkel songs, and one of their tracks that I think is criminally underrated. I'm always surprised that more people don't talk about this song. Between the beautiful vocal parts, the sweet guitar accompaniment, and the very pretty background parts and instrumentations, just the perfect Simon and Garfunkel track, in my opinion. And side 1 delivers 2 more incredible tracks with Homeward Bound and 59th Street Bridge Song. Both of these would also make my list of top 10 Simon and Garfunkel tracks. So this album does have a lot of songs that I hold in very high regard. But at the same time, there are still a couple of tracks that I think do take away from the album a little bit. I'm not crazy about the Big Bright Green Pleasure Machine on side 1, unfortunately. So there are 2 songs on side 1 that I'm not crazy about. But I do think that side 2 is a little more consistent. It has 6 tracks, and I really enjoy 5 of the 6 songs. The only one I'm not crazy about on side 2 is a simple desultory Philippic. And while I do think that side 2 is more consistent, for me, all of the best songs on this album do happen on side 1, so that's always been an interesting dichotomy on this album for me. But regardless of that, I think it's inarguable that this album was an upgrade from their first 2 releases and is their most cohesive and consistent album to date, delivering us some classic Simon and Garfunkel hits like Homeward Bound, 59th Street Bridge Song, For Emily, Whenever I May Find Her, and Scarborough Fair. So a great album. This one will get an A. Okay, next we have their 4th studio album from 1968 titled Bookends, and I will give this one an S. Amazing album, and an even further improvement from the previous release, in my opinion. We have 12 tracks, which are all originals. This is the first album to feature no covers, and side 1 consists of 7 songs, which actually function as a concept album that explores life's journey going from childhood to old age, and it opens up with a beautiful short guitar instrumental titled Bookends Theme, which will start and end side 1. Side 1 will end with a reprise of it, and I really like the way this theme functions as the beginning and end of side 1. I think the guitar work is very pretty, and the vocal work on the reprise is very beautiful as well. I will say that I don't love every single song on side 1. Save the Life of My Child is not one of my favorites, and Voices of Old People I think I could have done without. I don't really think it adds anything to the side. But the songs that I do like on side one, I think are some of the most exceptional Simon and Garfunkel tracks ever written, particularly with America and Old Friends, both of which would make my top 10 Simon and Garfunkel song list. And I consider Old Friends to be another one of their most underrated songs, another one that I'm shocked doesn't get more praise. I think it is just so exceptionally beautiful, and the instrumentation is so dreamy and atmospheric with the string section complementing the vocals and guitar perfectly. And I love how the track connects into the bookends reprise so nicely to conclude side one. I also think Overs is a very enjoyable and pretty song as well. Side 2 has 5 tracks, which consist of a couple of songs that were used for the movie The Graduate, as well as some singles that were released from previous years. So side 2 definitely feels much different than side 1 and can almost feel like an entirely different album. But I do find the contrast enjoyable, and for me personally, it doesn't really take away from the album because side 2 is still very strong with some amazing tracks like Punky's Dilemma, Mrs. Robinson, and A Hazy Shade of Winter. Punky's Dilemma would probably be my favorite song on side 2. I think that song has a real sweetness and gentleness to it that I love so much. The only song on side 2 I could do without is Fakin' It. So as you could see, I don't love every single song on here, and I wouldn't say it's a perfect album, but the overwhelming majority of the songs on here are incredible, and for me would definitely warrant putting it in S tier. Like I said, it contains America and Old Friends, which not only would make my top 10 favorite songs of theirs, but would probably even make it down on the top 5 list as well. So I hold those 2 songs in very high regard, and with the exception of the 3 songs that I mentioned not being crazy about, I think the remainder of this album is incredibly strong and their best album to date. So a great album, this one gets an S. Okay, and lastly, we have their 5th and final studio album from 1970 titled Bridge Over Troubled Water, and I will also give this one an S. Another amazing album, and if I had to pick a favorite between this and Bookends, I would say that for me, Bookends has more individual tracks that I really like, but as far as an overall album with consistent flow from front to back, this has got to be their best album. And I think it's for good reason that this album is widely regarded as their best work. It has 11 songs with 9 originals and 2 covers, and we have a lot more variety going on from an instrumental and stylistic standpoint, but it's all done very effectively and doesn't feel scattered from track to track. Side 1 has 5 songs, and it kicks us off with the beautiful title track, Bridge Over Troubled Water, which is a piano-centered track, which is something that we're not used to hearing from Simon and Garfunkel. And this has got to be one of my favorite songs from this album, and a perfect way to open up their final release. I really enjoy the remainder of side 1, with the exception of one track titled Keep the Customer Satisfied, and that is the one song on this album that really never did much for me. But the remaining 3 songs are all great. E Condor Pasa changes the mood and gives us this mellow and moody track with lush instrumentations, with the flute backgrounds, sounding similar to a track that would be on a Paul Simon solo album. That would be another favorite track on this album for me. And then Cecilia brings the mood and tempo up with a driving acoustic strumming pattern and a feel-good harmonized vocal melody. And So Long Frank Lloyd Wright brings the mood back down to a mellow, chill vibe with some really interesting chord movements in the guitars and a very dreamy vocal melody with nice string backgrounds. Another favorite on here for me as well. So a very strong side 1. And then side 2 keeps up the momentum with 6 more tracks, opening up with The Boxer, which is another classic Simon and Garfunkel track. Then we have Baby Driver, which brings the tempo up a bit and gives us some more bluesy and rock flavors. Then we get another sweet and pretty mid-tempo track with The Only Living Boy in New York. After that, we have Why Don't You Write Me, which gives us another song with a more rocking vibe. Probably my least favorite track on side 2, but not a bad song by any stretch. Then we have a live cover of Bye Bye Love, which is another very solid track, which sets up the final song very nicely, which is Song for the Asking. An absolutely beautiful track with all of the sounds I look for in a classic Simon and Garfunkel song. The beautiful and delicate vocal melodies, the pretty guitar part, the sweet string parts, and just the overall dreamy vibes of this song. Probably my favorite song on side 2, and just a beautiful closing track to the final Simon and Garfunkel album. And it's really unfortunate that this would be their last release, because I think they really went out on top of their game, and I can only imagine what else they would have came up with if they had continued making music into the 70s. So I do think this is their strongest and most consistent album of their entire discography. The songwriting is top-notch. There's just enough stylistic variety to keep things interesting but not sound incoherent, and in the midst of the variety in sounds, it still very much sounds like Simon and Garfunkel to me. And the group would unfortunately break up following this album due to a lot of tensions that were rising between the two of them. And one big thing that furthered this divide was that the director of The Graduate had cast both of them for a film that he was making titled Catch-22, and Paul Simon's part ended up getting cut from the movie, but Art still took part in it, which only furthered the divide that was already happening between them. And they would do little sporadic reunions in the 70s, 80s, 90s, and 2000s, but they were all pretty short-lived, and their final performance together would be in 2010. And apparently Art Garfunkel would be open to a reunion, but Paul Simon does not seem to be interested in that based on what I've read, and recently he retired from performing anyway, so it's highly unlikely that that will ever happen. And it's definitely a shame that these two guys are both still alive to this day, and they've both known each other since the 50s, having an incredibly long history together. And it's just a shame that their differences can't be reconciled at this point in their lives, because I think it would be really nice for them to just bury the hatchet and to be able to look back at the great music that they made together and appreciate the legacy that they left behind. But unfortunately, it is not looking like that will happen. But they put out an incredible final album that I think was just the cherry on top to seal their legacy. So an amazing final release. My favorite Simon and Garfunkel album. This one gets an S. Alright, we did it. We went through their 5 studio albums, and this is what I came up with. I will say that although some albums got lower scores than others, I don't think that this group has a bad album. I think each album is unique in its own regard and offers the listener a lot of great individual tracks, and this group has clearly cemented themselves as pivotal contributors to the music of the 60s and early 70s, and their songs will forever be timeless. So that is it for today. Thank you so much for watching. I hope it was enjoyable, and hopefully you learned a thing or two. And if you are interested, please feel free to check out my other tier lists, which will be linked in the comments and the description. I am sure there will be others that you will like, so please feel free to check that out. And like I said, let me know your thoughts in the comments, where you agree and disagree, and how you would rank these 5 albums. I would love to hear your thoughts. Okay, that's it for today. Thanks again for watching, and I will see you at the next video. Take care.